Hey guys, tonight we're hiking up a ragged stone slope under a pale moon, breathing in the chilled air of northern China's mountain frontier. Wind howls through the cracks in the Great Wall, and torchlight flickers in the narrow slits of a distant watchtower. Your boots crunch over frostbitten gravel. You reach the tower stone, stacked like ancient puzzle pieces, and just inside, a group of tired soldiers sit cross-legged around a tiny clay stove. They're not sharpening weapons. They're not looking out over the misty blackness. They're boiling tea. Steam curls up like incense, carrying the scent of roasted leaves and old smoke. It's the 1500s. You're cold, underslept, and probably a little doomed, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your city and local time in the comments below. I love seeing who's watching from where. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step inside the tower and immediately feel a different kind of warmth, not just the literal kind from the fire in the stove, but the kind that comes from ritual. The tea here isn't fancy. It's rough, bitter, gritty, with flecks of ash. But to the soldiers posted on this lonely stretch of the Great Wall, it's magic in a cup. Their eyes look less sunken when they sip. Their shoulders droop in relief. One of them nods at you like you're a regular. You said the fire they use to boil the tea has two purposes. 1. Keep them from freezing. 2. Send signals when needed. This was the original WIF black smoke columns stretching across hundreds of miles, warning of raiders. Tea and smoke shared the same fuel and, in a way, the same urgency. You can't spot enemies if your brain is foggy, and tea jolts the mind like a slap made of steam. You take your first sip. The ceramic bowl is chipped and still warm from someone else's hand. The tea, scalding, tastes like wet leather and pine needles, but also, somehow, safe. This is a place where boiling leaves means you're still alive, and you realize these tea stations weren't just an indulgence, they were survival. Historians still argue whether these tea setups were formal military installations or just unofficial comfort soldiers created themselves. Some believe every tower had a standard setup: kettle, clay, stove, jars of loose leaf. Others think it depended on the captain's preferences on how many bribes the cook received that month. Still, archaeological digs show consistent remains of charred kettles and tea-scraped bowls across multiple provinces. Something was definitely brewing. The towers themselves are no joke. Roughly every 500 meters, a squat, square structure of stone or brick, each positioned within line of sight of the next. These weren't cozy places. Wind tore through the slits in the wall. In winter, snow drifted right through the doorway. Rats competed with soldiers for dried rations. Yet, there was always tea. Even in records from the Ming Dynasty, when resources were so tight they sometimes paid troops in cloth, tea still made them manifest. One fringe theory: the leaves weren't just for drinking. Some think soldiers use excess tea dregs to rub on their faces in winter, a natural antifreeze of sorts. Gross, sure, but better than frostbite. You imagine a soldier slathering lukewarm leaf mush across his cheeks while another rolls his eyes. You know, that's not what it's for, right? But hey, anything to survive. And about those stories. Nighttime on the wall stretched into a whole separate universe. You'd be perched high above a cliff, surrounded by fog, sometimes with only one or two others. Naturally, ghost stories emerged. One popular tale involved a phantom tea seller who appeared only during snowstorms. She'd offer a piping hot brew, then vanish before sunrise. Take the tea, and you'd live. Refuse it, and you'd be found frozen stiff by morning. Totally unverified, obviously, but remember, fear and caffeine both keep you alert. You finish your bowl. One soldier hands you another, already refilled. He smiles, a rare thing in a place like this, and gestures to a stained cloth bundle in the corner. The tea stash is tied up like a baby, more precious than salt or coins. Sometimes tea was even used as currency compressed into little bricks, traded among troops like underground poker chips. You think you're clever? Offering a ration biscuit for another cup. The cook laughs in your face. Nice try. The clink of a ladle, the hiss of water hitting hot stone. And through the narrow tower slit, you see another watchtower spark to life in the distance. A puff of smoke by day, a torch by night. Signal protocol on the Great Wall was sophisticated, almost elegant. 1 puff for trouble, 2 for urgent, 3 for run for your life. You wonder how many times that tea fire got pushed aside for the signal fire. How many kettles were knocked over in the panic. Still, when the smoke clears and quiet returns, the tea goes back on. Always, you lay back on the cold floor, bowl resting on your chest. The tower breathes with the wind, and you realized tea wasn't just comfort. It was continuity across centuries, dynasties, and different stretches of stone. Those boiling kettles connected the lonely hearts stationed here like a thread of steam across time. You're woken by the scrape of flint and steel and the low groan of someone stretching after too little sleep on a stone floor. The tower is quieter now. The fire has been coaxed back to life, and water boils again in a squat iron kettle. That seemed better centuries. One soldier grumbles, cold again, and another says, tea first, watch second. It's not even a joke. It's doctrine. You shuffle over and grab your bowl warm from where it sat, near the hearth. The new batch smells stronger, leafier, like someone dug into the good stash. Someone important must be visiting. Sure enough, there's a gruff voice outside, barking orders, followed by the creak of leather armor and the clink of ceremonial sabers. A captain, maybe even a regional commander. He enters with a swirl of fur-lined robes and a look that says he hasn't slept in weeks. What does he do first? You guessed it. He pours himself some tea. This is where you start to grasp just how essential tea was, not just to the rank-and-file grunts half frozen in the towers, but to the men who commanded them. Great wall commanders were expected to be decisive, durable, and awake. The awake part, mostly thanks to tea. Historical records from the Ming and Qing dynasties list multiple tea deliveries along military routes, some disguised as medicinal herbs, others openly labeled as imperial provisions. And these weren't just cheap leads. Some commanders insisted on premium teas, like longang or pu'er, even in far-flung border outposts. One Ming general reportedly had a servant whose only job was to clean his tea tools and steep leaves, precisely at the 6th bell. Fancy. Of course, not every officer had that luxury. Most just had their own battered travel sets, cattle, a jar, maybe a lacquered scoop. One amusing fringe discovery: a carved bamboo tea whisk found buried beneath the rubble of a collapsed outpost. Experts still argue whether it belonged to a soldier with refined tastes or someone just really bad at stirring. You sip again. The tea tastes slightly better this time, less ash, more earth. Maybe it's just warmer. Or maybe you're adapting outside. Wind rakes over the watchtower's edge like claws on slate. Your face burns from cold air. Your fingers sting. Tea isn't just warmings anchoring. You imagine trying to stand guard for 6 hours straight in sleet without it. Good luck staying awake. One written account from 1573 describes a soldier slumped against the parapet, snow in his ears, and ends with the line, his kettle was frozen solid. Whether that's poetic flourish or grim reality, you'd rather not find out firsthand. There's a rhythm: Hebrew, sip, patrol, repeat. It's meditative in a brutal sort of way. And while coffee may wake you with a jolt, tea wakes you like a gentle prod. just enough to keep your sword arm from going slack. Scholars debate whether tea was officially included in troop rations. Some say yes, pointing to government-issued bricks of compressed leaf matter, cheap, rough, often mixed with other herbs. Others say tea had to be brought from home, smuggled in with letters and dried dumplings. One theory: tea brick fragments were hidden inside hollow sections of bamboo, the original caffeine smuggling operation. Either way, you feel it now, the warmth creeping into your limbs, the clarity seeping into your thoughts, and you're not alone. Look around. Each soldier holds a bowl. Nobody talks much, not because they're unfriendly, but because the tea has created a pause, a moment where no one has to pretend they're tough or immortal. It's just human. Then, a tiny moment of theater. The commander's aide walks in with a fresh pouch of leaves. The bag is embroidered. Bright red silk. That's not standard issue. Someone pulls rank, and everyone perks up. New leaves mean a better brew, possibly even flavor. You catch the scent before you see the steam. Roasted chestnut, maybe a hint of citrus. One soldier whispers, "Tribute tea," eyes wide. Whether or not that's true, doesn't matter. It feels important. Even in war, even in wind, there's ceremony. You notice something else? 2. The tea isn't just keeping people awake, it's keeping them civil. One written anecdote from a garrison near the Jiayu Pass tells of a near brawl between soldiers over stolen rations. A captain intervened, not by shouting, but by sitting both parties down and pouring them tea. "Sip before you strike," he said. The fight dissolved like sugar in boiling water, and sometimes it was more than just about commit, it was about timing. One speculative theory says commanders used the tea ritual as a clock. Till, boiled in about 12 minutes. Good. Brew steeped in 3. Perfect for measuring shift changes, timed marches, or even covert meetings. You don't need a sundial if your kettle sings right on time. The commander speaks finally. His voice is low, gravelly. "This wall doesn't hold because of bricks," he says. "It holds because we keep showing up. It's because we boil the water, no matter what." The soldiers nod. They've heard it before, but it lands differently. Each time your tea is nearly gone, you scrape the last leaves with your teeth, savoring the slight bitterness, and you wonder how many thousands, maybe millions of cups were brewed along these towers. Each one a tiny act of defiance against cold, boredom, and the occasional Mongol cavalry charge. You head out onto the parapet. Below, the hills are frosted, silver. The wind bites, but your belly glows with heat. Another tower flickers to life in the distance, and for a few quiet seconds, the great wall feels less like a fortress and more like a spine-each vertebra, lit, warm, and steeped in tea. The next morning hits like a wet slap. There is frost crusted in the seams of your boots, and the sun hasn't bothered to rise properly, just smeared a little pale light across the horizon like it's clocking in late. You rub sleep from your eyes and hear it again, the telltale clink of ladle against kettle. Tea time. But this time, the brew smells richer. Someone's gone off script. Inside the watchtower, the commander sits cross-legged, swirling something in his bowl with great focus. You squint. Is that ... flower petals? The cook smirks and whispers, "Jasmine, pearls, don't ask." You do, of course. Turns out the commander had them delivered via a silk merchant, 3 weeks late and 1 horse short. "Worth it," he says. "Tea keeps my spine straight," he mutters, "and my sword arm steady." And that's where things start getting decadent, because some great wall commanders, especially during the Ming Dynasty, weren't just tea drinkers. They were tea obsessives. There's written evidence of a general near the Juyang Pass who insisted on mountain spring water to brew his oolong. Legend says his scouts were tasked not with finding enemies, but with identifying sweet and mineral-rich snowmelt Priorities, you see. While tea started as a necessity on the wall heat, alertness, morality became something more for the men in charge. It was a luxury, a symbol, a status flex. You might not have silk robes in a remote tower, but if you had a tin of Songyera white tea, you were basically royalty with frostbite. Historians still argue whether this tea mania was officially encouraged or just tolerated. One side claims that emperors promoted high-quality tea among their officers as a morale tool. The other insists it was a symptom of bored commanders with too much time and not enough battles. What we do know is that elite officers sometimes received tribute to terrier, expensive leaves grown in imperial gardens. There are records of bricks of compressed tea being wrapped in silk, stamped with the seal of the Ministry of Rights, and sent by courier across the empire's arteries. Some of that tea ended up right here, inside drafty towers with icicles hanging from the roof beams. Can you imagine the contrast? A rugged outpost, walls scratched by wind, and inside, a commander using a porcelain gaiwan to decant tea like he's at a poetry reading. 'Cause, for them, tea wasn't just caffeine. It was control, precision, a small, perfect world in the chaos of watch shifts and wolf howls. And you'd better believe there were rules. Some commanders followed meticulous routines, 3 grams per cup, water poured clockwise, no talking. During steeping, you break the rhythm, you get side-eyed. Break it twice, and you're on firewood duty. Again, one French discovery supports this obsession. 17th century tea diary found buried with an officer near the Shanghai Pass. The leather-bound book includes tasting notes, actual tasting notes. Lines like, "Too woody likely mishandled during transport and brewed at full boil regrettably vulgar." Kia, did the man record his troop movements or supply levels? Nope. Just how that batch of Tiguanyan made him feel emotionally. Iconic. You laugh quietly at the thought, then take another sip of jasmine infused to survival. You can almost taste the self-importance, but beneath the fancy leaves and ceremonial sipping, there's something deeper. Tea gave these commanders a moment of ownership, a shred of civilization in places that felt utterly abandoned. On the worst days, they couldn't control the weather. They couldn't predict raids, but they could measure the temperature of their water to the degree they could perfect a pour. They could sit back, straight, and make the world obey just for a moment. One story, possibly apocryphal, but too delicious to skip. It tells of a general who brewed an entire pot of rare green tea in silence while his tower was under siege. He offered a bowl to each officer, stared through the slit at the approaching enemy, and said, "Let's drink. Then we'll fight." They won. Or at least, that's how the tale goes. You can see the ritual seeping into every corner of the watchtower. A wooden crate becomes a makeshift tea bench. A chipped bowl is cleaned so carefully, it might as well be porcelain. The youngest soldier gets assigned leaf-sorting duty, not as punishment, but as training. You can tell a man by how he treats his tea, the commander says. You don't doubt it, and this isn't just a Chinese phenomenon. Accounts of border trade with Mongols mention bartering not just raw tea bricks, but also infused tea tools ornate. Strainers, carved spoons, brass kettles with inlaid handles. Tea was currency, yes, but it was also culture, even diplomacy. You peer out the window, slit again. Fog drapes the hills like an old coat. Another tower sends a brief flash of smoke maybe. A test, maybe a real alert. You look back. The commander hasn't flinched. His kettles still bubbling, precise as ever. That's the other thing about these tie-obsessed leaders. They weren't just indulgent. They were centered. Tea gave them rhythm. And rhythm meant readiness. Every steeping is preparation. One general supposedly said, "Hot water teaches patience. Leaves teach alertness. Flavor teaches timing." It sounds dramatic, but when you've got nothing but cold stone and 24 half-awake men between you and a potential invasion, a little drama helps. The commander finally stands. He downs his last sip and hands the bowl to a junior soldier without looking. Nod. Time to patrol. You watch him walk up the steps, armor clinking softly. You think this guy just might win a battle with a tea leaf and a glare. You hear it before you see it crunching snow, sloshing buckets. The soft muttering of someone cursing under their breath as icy water sloshes down their sleeves. You lean out slightly from the tower's upper slit, eyes squinting into the gray. Morning light as two soldiers are hauling water from the frozen stream at the base of the hill. Again, the same to who drew the short sticks. Again, you smile. Not because you're mean, because you know what this means. Tea is happening again. And that's the thing. You can't have a tea ritual without water. Okay. And water, especially decent water, isn't easy to come by on the ridgelines of northern China. Great wall watchtowers didn't exactly come with plumbing or heating or anything really. So you begin to realize the true logistics ballet behind that humble cup of warmth. And as you wrap your hands around a fresh bowl, you start thinking of everything it took to make it happen. First, the water itself. Depending on the tower's location, you either had a nearby spring lucky, a well rare, or a journey to the nearest melt-fed stream. Soldiers routinely walked miles for it. Some would even chip blocks of ice and haul them back, then melt them inside, using clay kettles over smoky pine fires. Just enough for a few steepings and, maybe, a sponge bath. Someone had really irritated the captain. One surviving record from a garrison near Zhangjiakou describes an entire water rota, a rotating assignment just for sourcing, carrying, boiling, and preserving water during winter months. The most trusted soldier guarded the kettle during steeping. They called him the Leaf Keeper. Sounds like a fantasy novel, but it's real. And as with everything else, there was snobbery involved. Officers didn't just want any water. They wanted live water, flowing water, water that hadn't sat too long, which apparently made tea taste stale. There are notes in the 1592 manual that describe ideal snowmelt as light as a breeze and free of bitterness. Historians still argue whether that's poetic nonsense or early water chemistry. Probably both. Then comes the fuel. Most towers burned pine wood or brush, gathered daily by exhausted, wind-chapped sentries. But if your tower was unlucky, you used whatever wood, burnt animal dung, dried grass, even bits of old gear. One fringe detail. Archaeologists once found a carefully hoarded stash of sandalwood chips buried beneath a collapsed watchtower pantry. Either someone was hiding scented kindling or planning a tea session to impress the emperor himself. Next, the tools. You're probably imagining dainty porcelain and bamboo trays. Reality check. Most watchtower setups were rugged, cast iron, kettles blackened from years of smoke, battered wooden ladles, cracked earthenware bowls passed down from that guy who got frostbite 2 winters ago. And yet, even in this rough setup, soldiers took time to clean, arrange, and steep with care.why. Because tea wasn't just a drink. It was a transition from sleep to wake, from fear to readiness, from freezing stillness to controlled motion. The tea officer, a kind of informal quartermaster role, was often the most envied job in the tower. That guy, he got to stay inside during storms. He got first dibs on good leaves, and he controlled the fire. Power, basically. There's an old joke scratched into the stone wall of a tower near Battling that reads, "He who holds the ladle rules the post," which might be ancient sarcasm, more just timeless truth. Even the act of boiling water was rhythmic. Listen long enough, and you'd notice how soldiers timed their routines by the kettle's hiss. Morning watch begins with the first big bubble. Midday break. It's called when the steam curls sharp. One source even describes a tower that used the tea boil as its official shift buzzer. 1 whistle, change posts. 2 whistles, enemy spotted. 3, captains in a mood. And when the tea's finally brewed, it becomes ceremony. Soldiers cluster close, passing bowls. Some gulp, some slurp, a few hold theirs like chalices. The steam fogs the room. It warms not just fingers, but morale. But here's a fun, weird detail. At some towers, especially along the desert routes, they added salt. Yep, salted tea. Historians believe this originated with soldiers stationed near Mongol trading zones, where salted milk tea was common. And once it caught on, it stuck. One Mingera ledger even records an entire budget line for brine bricks for tea use. You won't find that at your neighborhood boba shop. Of course, tastes varied. Some towers had access to good leaves, others reused them. One tongue-in-cheek letter from a soldier reads, "We have had this leaf for 9 days now. You may ask too. Be paid soon." Same energy as using a single tea bag all week. There were hacks, too. Some soldiers added dried goji berries or chrysanthemum petals if they had access. Not for taste, though it helped, but because they believed it kept the eyes sharp. Important when scanning the horizon for raiders or wild boars. And as always, the commander's brew was different. His water might be double boiled, his kettle lined with clay. One account even says a general used rainwater gathered from eagle feathers. Sounds fake? Possibly was, but impressive. You step back inside as a fresh batch finishes. The kettle squeals, steam hits your face, and the scent is sharp, nutty, comforting. Someone got creative again as you sit, sip, and feel the heat. Chase the cold out of your ribs. It hits you. This tea wasn't just made. It was fought for, carried from a mountain, boiled with smoke-stung eyes, guarded like treasure, and now finally you get to drink it. Your lips are still tingling from that last sip when someone bursts into the tower room, panting like a bellows, okay? His cloak's half frozen, and his expression says, "This isn't about tea." Sadly, you tense. Could be wolves, could be raiders, could be the cook trying to sneak barley into the tea again, but it's none of those. The messenger straightens and blurts out the words, "Inspection, 3 days." You feel the room pause like the whole tower holds its breath. Not because inspections are rare, but because inspections mean one thing for certain: outside eyes. And outside eyes mean judgments. And one of the very first things they check, the tea station. Yes, you heard that right. On the Great Wall, even the imperial inspectors judged a tower's readiness, not just by armory condition or watch routines, but by whether the tea station was up to code. You see, by the height of the Ming Dynasty, the army had developed protocols, standards. Tea wasn't just a habitat, was a system, a measured, semi-ritualized, semi-bureaucratized part of life on the wall. There's actual documentation from the 16th century regulations that dictated who could brew, how much leaf per soldier per day, and even how often kettles had to be scoured. Spoiler alert, not often enough. Historians still argue whether this was an efficiency policy or a sneaky morale monitor. Some say the inspection of tea stations was meant to ensure warmth and discipline. Others believe it was more like checking a soldier's locker today. If your tea tools were dirty, what else were you letting slide? Cute. Think of it as the toothbrush test. Great Wall Edition. Inspections could come with or without warning. You were lucky. Word traveled up the signal towers in time. You'd have a full day to clean the hearth, polish the ladle, maybe bribe the water haulers with dried dates to actually scrub the kettle this time. If not, well, then it was damage. Control. One old scroll preserved in a regional archive includes a list titled Emergency Tea Drill. It outlines how to fake a functioning tea station in under 15 minutes. Step 1. Pour hot water over the used leaves and act like you're mid-steep. Step 2. Clear rat droppings from the sugar tin. Step 3. Don't let the inspector actually taste anything. There are anecdotes, some, probably, exaggerate about commanders being demoted, not for poor defense or failed patrols, but for shoddy tea practice. One unlucky officer near Jiawan was reportedly reassigned to latrine construction because his garrison was caught using stale water from a wash bucket. He claimed it was medicinal. The inspector was not impressed. Yet for all the stress, inspections often meant upgrades too. Some towers used the events as leverage. See, we need a new stove. The inspector said so. Others got surprise supply drops. The visiting official was in a good mood. He might leave behind higher quality leaves or even a fresh kettle. One legendary story tells of a young tea officer who served such a flawless brew during inspection that he was offered a spot in the imperial kitchen. He declined, said he preferred the mountains. Madman. Inspections also fostered competition. Towers would try to outdo each other, not just in cleanliness, but in tea flair. Our cinnamon bark blend will bring tears to your eyes. One garrison bragged in a chalk-scrawled letter sent with a passing courier. The reply from a tower 2 days east simply read, "Your tears must be from shame." Of course, it wasn't all good-natured. Some commanders hoarded their best tea and served the inspectors mediocre leaves, fearing that generosity would backfire. Others staged elaborate demonstrations of team unity and ceremonial discipline, every soldier sipping in sync. Bowls held exactly chest-high, no slurping. Specters saw right through it, but still gave points for the effort. One particularly memorable incident at least, if the tower graffiti is to be believed, involved an inspection where the officer requested a second cup. Everyone panicked. They'd only packed enough impressive leaves for one brew. A junior soldier tried to distract him with poetry. It worked, barely, but perhaps the most fascinating aspect of tea inspections is how they reflected the empire's view of discipline. The thinking was simple. If a tower could maintain order and precision in something as small as tea, it was probably doing all right with arrows and alarm beacons. You don't let your guard down if your steeping time is perfect. It's a small-scale metaphor, and one that you begin to see everywhere now. In the way the soldiers clean their bowls before each use, in the careful rationing of leaves to last through the week, in the silent nod the commander gives before the first steep. This isn't just survival, it's style. One fringe theory suggests that elite spies were sometimes embedded as inspectors and that they used tea quality as a cover to study troop loyalty. Seems like a stretch, but then again, if you really wanted to see how a place ran, watching how it handled something mundane might tell you more than any interrogation. Hint, nothing on the Great Wall was more mundanely sacred than tea. You look around your own tower as the inspection countdown begins. Someone's already polishing the kettle. Someone else is arguing with the cook about whether yarrow root is too medicinal for inspection tea. It's a commander. .com as ever, watching the snow melt in a shallow bowl, probably planning to use it for his signature 9-second pour. Guy's a show-off. There's tension in the air, but also excitement. Because if there's one thing a Watchtower garrison longs for more than hot teats, the chance to prove that it's the best Watchtower garrison. And for some reason, that starts with a leaf. 3 days later, you're standing ramrod straight, bowl in hand, trying to act like this is the most natural thing in the world, like your palms aren't sweating, like you haven't scrubbed this bowl with such obsessive vigor that you may have invented exfoliation centuries early. The inspector's boots crunch on the stone floor slow, deliberate. His robe flaps gently in the mountain wind that somehow finds its way into every crack of the tower. His face is unreadable. His hands, gloved in lambskin, are clasped behind his back like he's attending a funeral for poor behavior. This is not the time to slurp. He stops before your tea hearth. The kettle is steaming just right, not too timid. The ladle rests precisely at a 45-degree angle, not touching the side. Its bowls are aligned like little ceramic soldiers. The inspector sniffs. Just once. Then gestures. Proceed. Cue. And this, right here, is the theater of the tea station. It's not just practical its performance, and Watchtower soldiers. They trained for it like a stage cast, rehearsing under threat of axe. What the inspector doesn't see, what nobody outside the tower ever sees, is how much practice this took. Because in the months leading up to this, your garrison had been drilling. No, not spears and drills, choreography. Timing the perfect pour, calibrating the leaf-to-water ratio so it didn't taste too bitter, but still said, "We care." Even learning how to pour without your hands trembling. When someone with the power to reassign you to Yakuti was watching, one scholarly record from the Ming archives mentions harmony rituals conducted along the northernmost sections of the wall. These were stylized tea sessions meant to demonstrate unity, calm, and control. And yes, those sessions were staged for inspections, but they also reflected something deeper, a culture of collective rhythm. You weren't just showing off a clean kettle, you were showing off discipline under pressure. And ironically, the better you got at it, the more the performance began to feel real. The inspector takes the bowl, sniffs, sips. He pauses. Now, here's a fun historical tidbit. In some regions, especially near Liaodong, garrisons added a pinch of roasted barley to the steep, not for flavor, not for health, because it gave the tea a golden sheen, visually richer, fancier. Some believe this started as a happy accident from a dropped grain sack. Others think it was a low-key bribe technique. Either way, the inspector's brow lifts ever so slightly at the shimmer. Good sign. But he's not here just for your tea. Acrobatics. He checks the logbook, scans the ration records, specs the heart's ashpalib. He's counting fuel usage by eye, a clever trick to detect if you've been hoarding for black market stew parties. Then, with the flair of a traveling judge, he nods once, just once, and moves on to the next garrison. The room exhales as one, and that, you realize, is the paradox of these inspections. They're stressful, political, sometimes ridiculous, but weirdly bonding. Your garrison is tighter now. You've shared firewood, argued over leaf measurements, burned your hands on kettles, and somehow managed to create something civilized out of smoke, snow, and soldier sweat. Here's a strange but real account. One inspection officer from the 15th century was so moved by the garrison's tea ceremony that he wrote a haiku. Well, the Chinese equivalent hand had it carved into a stone beside the hearth. A few years later, during renovations, that stone was reused as a latrine slab. Historians still argue whether that was poetic justice or just poor planning. And yet, the prestige of passing an inspection wasn't fleeting. A positive report meant better rations, sometimes even bonuses, or, more importantly, priority on new leaf shipments. Cause yes, Yvonne, up here, where you can barely feel your fingers, there's a hierarchy of tea. The first pick, hand-harvested, early in spring from imperial gardens, never made it here. That went straight to the Forbidden City, or two high-ranking ministers with more silk than sense. But the second tier leaves, or even third. Those were up for grabs, and a commendation could push your garrison up the delivery list, which is why some towers got sneaky. One account undeniably French, but preserved in regional folklore describes a tower that hired a local theater troupe to pose as its tea unit during inspection. The real soldiers hid upstairs, The actors bowed, poured, served, and exited in perfect unison. The inspector declared it the most disciplined outpost he'd ever seen. Then one of the soldiers dropped his mustache into the kettle. Scandal, despite the strictness, tea inspections also carried a weird kind of prestige. Getting complimented on your steeping style. That was like winning best dressed at a war camp. One soldier even carved a badge from a discarded tea tin lid and wore it under his armor. When asked what it was, he simply said, "My medal." There's even a scroll from a garrison logbook with this line: We live on cliffs, sleep in smoke, and drink bitterness, but our tea is sweet, and so we are kings. You sip your second bowl now, no longer needing to impress anyone. The room is quieter, relaxed. Someone starts humming. The commander cracks a smiling, actual smile. Someone else tosses a date pit into the hearth and says, "Next time, let's add ginger." And the weirdest part, you start to think about doing it again, planning for the next inspection, expecting the routine, perfecting the pour. Not because you're scared, but because it gave the tower purpose, a rhythm, a reason to polish, to prep, to wake early and get it right. Maybe that's why they cared so much about tea, because in a place built for war, surrounded by isolation, fear, and freezing wind, the one thing you could control, the one thing that demanded precision, grace, and patience was this tiny, steaming bowl in your hands. You wake the next morning to the quiet sound of water dripping from the roof tiles. Snow melt, a rare warmth seeps into the stone of the tower. And for a fleeting moment, you could almost believe spring is trying to arrive early, almost downstairs. Someone is already feeding sticks into the hearth. The kettle hasn't even whistled yet, but you're moving, bowl in hand, like muscle memories taking over. And as you sit cross-legged on the old floorboards, heat rising against your knees, you realize something strange. You're not just drinking tea. You're thinking in tea. It's infiltrated your routines, your reflexes, even the way you speak. Someone forgets to salt the fish. Tastes like weak leaf. You stub your toe. Hot kettle becomes your go-to expletive. You're not alone. This is a tower-wide condition, and it has a name, tie brain. Sure, historians don't call it that, but they do talk about the psychological effects of long-term tea culture on isolated garrisons. Some write about how the ritual of brewing helped regulate mood and reduce cabin fever flare-ups. Others suggest it blurred the line between discipline and obsession. This section of the wall, the cold northern slopes facing the Mongolian plateau, was infamous for turning soldiers into monks. Not from prayer, from steeping. It was a kind of slow-burning devotion, secular sacredness. One quirky record from a song. Dynasty Outpost describes a soldier who refused to fight one morning because the water had not sung yet. That is, the kettle hadn't boiled. He later claimed he couldn't hold a spear without his daily pour. Would you trust a man to aim an arrow with trembling hands? He reportedly asked. His commander, fine demand, then adopted the rule for the whole garrison. Your tower is no different. There's now an unofficial rule. No orders until the kettle sings. It's not written down anywhere, but it's understood. Break it, and the cook gives you the bad ladle. You chuckle, remembering a heated debate 2 nights ago whether tea brewed during sunrise boosts morale more than afternoon leaf. The argument got so intense that someone pulled out a compass. You've never seen so many grown men silently hating the sun. Historians still argue whether this level of ritualized obsession had tangible military benefits. Some believe it made towers more resilient, keeping soldiers grounded. Others think it was a form of escapism, one that distracted them from the fact they were freezing, lonely, and increasingly convinced that squirrels were spying on them. What's undeniable is that tea culture on the wall evolved into its own peculiar identity. Regional garrisons developed preferences and quirks. The western towers liked smoky blends, sometimes laced with bits of pine or dried tangerine peel. The eastern towers went herbal, tossing in chrysanthemum or licorice root when they could. Get it? One notorious garrison even added garlic. For clarity, they said. For horrific burps. Everyone else said. Tower identity became entangled with tea reputation. Forget weapons. You judged a unit by its kettle. Letters between commanders would casually include jabs, like, "Hope your leaf this year is stronger than your left flank." But it went beyond pride. These rituals were armor, not made of steel, but rhythm. On long, wine-torn nights, when the fire ran low and the tower creaked like a ship lost at sea. The only constant was the next cup. You knew it was coming. You had a role in making it. It mattered. And tea wasn't just something you drank, it was something you did, something shared. A communal act that softened the edges of isolation. You'd lean your back against a stone, wall warmed faintly by the hearth, and talk about nothing and everything over that quiet steam. Who watched the stars move last night? Whether that hawk keeps circling because it likes your hair. If the emperor really drinks the same leaves as you. Spoiler, he doesn't. There's a story, probably embroidered with time, about Ming Tower where two soldiers used tea ceremonies to settle disputes. Not rock, paper, scissors, not wrestling, just a steep off. The one who made the better bowl got to pick the patrol route, and the commander allowed it. Said it made more sense than watching them hit each other with mops. Of course, tie brain has its dangers. One poor soul down the line grew so fixated on temperature perfection that he constructed a wind-blocked tunnel out of firewood to shelter the kettle's flame. Effective, sure, until he used half the winter fuel. That spring, he was transferred to dung-drying duty. It's not exactly a promotion. Still, there's something admirable in the madness, something about humans shaping ceremony from scarcity. Even in wind-burnt towers where half the rations are root vegetables pretending to be food, they brewed warmth into every corner. What started as survival turned into a kind of elegance. And now you find yourself recognizing steeping styles, the way city folks recognize handwriting. The commander prefers a long pour from high up, flashy but risky. The cook uses a wide swirl, like he's stirring fate. That new guy, he dunks the leaf directly in the bowl and calls it innovative. You call it lazy. You pour your own bowl now, letting the scent drift up, smoky, bitter, a little grassy. It tastes like ash and defiance, like routine and rebellion, like memory. Some towers kept tea logs, not ration ledgers, but actual tasting notes. Tuesday, leaf oversteeped, like regret. Snow batch, slightly mineral, est, after 5 minutes. One such log was found centuries later, tucked behind a brick, stained but readable. It's now in a museum, labeled Emotional Inventory of Tower 98. You sip again and realize tie brain isn't just about the leaves. It's about the things the leaves make possible. Silence, conversation, reflection, a pause long enough to feel human, even inside a uniform, and up here on a wall meant to keep the world out. Being human is maybe the most radical act of all. Your teeth are chattering, not from fear, though you wouldn't exactly call yourself relaxed, but from the cold that's returned with a fresh vengeance. Spring teased you and then left without so much as a goodbye. The wind howls through the air. Watchtower again, like it's auditioning for a horror story. You tighten your cloak and grip your bowl tighter, not because it's full, but because it's warm. You huddle with 2 other soldiers near the tea hearth. No one talks. There's no need. The silence is familiar, companionable, the kind you only earn after too many months and not enough changes of socks. The kettle starts its low whisper of readiness, and someone nobody's really sure who, tea, reaches forward. With the ladle, here's where things get a little weird. You've always known tea was about more than comfort. It was warmth, morale, ritual, but what you didn't know until very recently is that the tea you're drinking might also be helping you see better in the dark. Sounds ridiculous, right? But there's a rumor, started with a scout who returned from the western ridge, claiming he could spot torchlight flickers 6 miles out while everyone else squinted at fog. Must be the wolfberry tea, he said, smug as a cat with secrets. You all laughed. But then someone brewed a batch with dried wolfberries for the night shift. And wouldn't you know, it's your eyes did feel a little sharper. Now, historians today still argue whether those garrison brews truly had functional benefits or were just placebos dressed as superstition. Some argue that herbal infusions like wolfberry, chrysanthemum, or even ginseng were added for real medical purpose, especially in colder regions. Others say it was just garrison gossip gone wild. But you know this? Nobody's turning down a bowl of ginseng leaf blend before a long patrol. Just in case. And that's just the beginning of the garrison's experimental tea era. Somewhere between desperation and creativity, you all began treating the tea station like a potion lab. You tried ginger for warmth, mint for headaches, pine needle steepings for coughing, till someone realized that the wrong pine would give you hallucinations in a 3-day nap. That particular batch was quietly buried. One garrison even imported bricks of puree tea and fermented them in old ration barrels. Another tried brewing over yak butter for energy. It mostly gave everyone what the logbook described as a sudden and irreversible sprint to the latrine. Despite some, let's say, gastrointestinal setbacks, these experiments mattered. Tea became a carrier of local knowledge, of trial and error, passed down like folklore. It was the closest thing many towers had to medicine, therapy, and sometimes oddly alchemy. In fact, cords show that certain watchtowers along the Hexy corridor developed entirely separate tea practices based on what herbs grew locally. One tower was famous for steeping snow lotus into their blends, not just because it looked cool floating in the bowl, but because it was rumored to cool the blood. And, let's be honest, after marching in armor under the desert sun, your blood needs a chill pill. You try one of these mixes tonight. A little licorice root, some crushed date, and a dash of hawthorn leaf. It smells strange, sweet, but sour. The cook calls it spearbender, because if you drink too much, your legs go soft. Still, your throat's been scratchy, and it seems worth the risk. This fringe approach to tea wasn't always appreciated by higher-ups. There's a hilarious court record involving a watchtower commander accused of corrupting imperial tradition by adding orange peel and plum wine to ceremonial leaf. He defended himself by claiming it improved morale. The court fined him, then apparently requested his recipe. That tension between tradition and improvisation defined much of the Wall's tea culture. On one hand, you had the official leaf, the ceremonial method, the inspections. On the other, you had freezing nights, sour stomachs, and a very human urge to tinker. Tea became both a symbol of conformity and rebellion. You sipped spearbender, your nose twitches. Not bad, little, tangy. Your throat does feel clearer. Your legs, so far, remain unspeared. There's another curious thing you've noticed, how the tea changes your conversations. You might start the night grumbling about ration sizes or the cold wind punching you in the kidneys. But by the second bowl, you're talking about dreams. Not metaphorical ones, weird ones. The kind you only get when your bed is a wooden plank and your ears are frozen. Last week, one of the younger soldiers claimed he dreamed that the wall stood up and walked away like a giant stone centipede. You asked if the tea was oversteeped. He said no, just slightly smoky. You don't dismiss it though, because these bowls, these shared sips, seem to pull something deeper out of people. You talk about old homes, lost friends, the weird loneliness of being surrounded by comrades, but still thinking. You're the only one who sees that flicker in the hills. There's a theory among modern researchers that tea acted as a social lubricant among garrison troops, lowering tension and promoting emotional vulnerability in otherwise rigid masculine environments. Basically, it helped guys talk about their feelings without punching each other. Even the commander, who's usually about as expressive as a brick, once told a story about the time he dropped his sword during a drill and cried because it reminded him of his brother. He was sipping ginger leaf when he said it. It's not just warmth, it's connection. A scholar once wrote, in the Watchtower, tea is language. Steam carries the words, too heavy for lips. You remember reading that, scratched into the back of a supply crate. Now, as the hearth crackles and the kettle simmers again, you realize just how accurate that is. This isn't a pause between patrols. It's the real moment. This bowl, this warmth, this bizarre spearbender blend, that's the anchor. Everything else, the shouting, the drills, the long cold hours on the parapets, just background. It's noise to this quiet act of sharing something hot and bitter and healing. You don't just feel better, you feel together. The wind tonight carries a different kind of silence, not the absence of sound, but the fullness of it, the way quiet can wrap around a place like a wool blanket, thick and heavy, the kind that makes you hold your breath and wonder what it's tan. Hiding, you stand on the parapet, tea in hand, watching stars blink like distant watchfires of their own. Somewhere out in the dark, wolves are howling, or men. Honestly, it's hard to tell from this distance. Behind you, the watchtower glows, faintly warm orange light leaking from arrows-lit windows, casting flickering tea shadows against the stone. You think back on all the nights like this, tea in one hand, fear in the other. Somehow, they've become old friends, and that's when you remember one of the strangest tales whispered along the wall, how tea once helped stop a war. Yes, really, according to one story, sometime during the Ming Dynasty. Tensions had reached a boiling point between a frontier watchtower garrison and a Mongol scouting party that refused to leave. Skirmishes had already flared, and commanders on both sides were bracing for bloodshed. But just as hostilities were about to snap, something absurd happened. The tea shipment was late. Not just any shipment. This was the good stuff, the imperial shoot. Brick tea that came from the south, pressed into squares so dense you could build with them. The garrison commander was livid. No tea meant no morale, and no morale meant no discipline. So he did the unthinkable. He requested a temporary truce. Tistis, buy tea from the Mongols. The Mongol leader, curious or just wildly amused, agreed. Struck a deal, okay? A bundle of horse hides for 2 bricks of fermented leaf. No bloodshed, no ambush. Just a weird, smoky brew shared around the fire that night by both sides, who sat in mutual silence, pretending not to enjoy it. Historians still argue whether this tea truce actually happened, or if it's one of those tower tales polished over centuries. But a few sketchy records and crumbling annals do suggest trade agreements between wall outposts and nomadic groups that involved bricks of tea exchanged for meat, salt, or intelligence. As one French historian put it, tea is the original fence-sitter. Q. Smile at the idea. A steaming bowl holding back war. There's something poetic about it, or maybe just absurd enough to be true. But this wasn't an isolated incident. Tea became an unexpected diplomatic tool in the shadowy world of frontier politics. Some commanders used rare blends to curry favor with visiting envoys. Others sent gifts of leaf wrapped in silk to rival towers as peace offerings, satially after, say, a patrol mistakenly wandered into someone else's hunting range, or accidentally set their supply cart on fire. Long story. There's a story passed between older guards about a commander who brewed an elaborate 6-leaf blend whenever officials from the capital visited. It was called the Fog of Obedience. Nobody knew what was in it, but somehow, the inspectors always left early and wrote glowing reviews. The cook swore he'd just added more sugar. The commander never said a word. Your own commander. Practical as an axe, sticks to roasted barley tea when dealing with border negotiations. Says it clears the tongue of lies. You're not sure what that means, but it definitely makes your mouth feel like sandpaper. Even among enemies, tea could blur the lines. There's an infamous sketch in a retired soldier's memoir showing two scouts, one from the wall, one from the steps, trading a small bag of leaf across a frozen river. No words, just a handoff. The caption underneath reads, "Before the next fight." You wonder about those moments. Not the wars, but the pauses between them. When men still saw each other as human long enough to trade heat and herbs before going back to being enemies. And yet, tea diplomacy wasn't always peaceful. Spies used tea too. That's right, your innocent little leaf might have carried more secrets than steam. In some towers, agents slipped messages into hollowed-out tea bricks, carving codes into compressed leaves like edible scrolls. Others used scent markers jasmine for safe, mugwort for danger, and one poor soul who misread a batch of wormwood as a go signal and launched a raid on his own caravan. During one border campaign, Ming general was nearly poisoned by a rival commander who swapped his tea blend for one laced with datura. The general survived but forever banned anything that smells too floral. Today, there's even a niche field of study focused on leaf cryptography. Seriously? Scholars still dig through archaeological tea bricks looking for microcarvings or residue patterns that could be codes. So far, the most conclusive discovery has been a smiley face in the word "hi" carved into a Tang Dynasty brick. So, maybe don't hold your breath. Still, it makes you look at your own cup a little differently. You swirl the dregs at the bottom, just leaf bits or the secrets of an empire. Probably just leaf bits, but still, you take another sip, watching the orange glow of the tower ripple against the dark. Somewhere below, a fox howls, or maybe just complains. Either way, it sounds like how you feel. The tea station behind you sputters as someone stokes the fire. Another shift is brewing literally in the new blend tonight. It's got dried date, longan fruit, and something the cook is calling peace root. You're 60% sure that's not an actual plant, but no one's correcting him. Not after what happened with the fermented garlic blend. You chuckle softly. That's how it is up here. Empires wage wars over territory and policy, but in the towers, it all boils down to bowls and blends. Tea as weapon, as whisper, as warmth. It's diplomacy in disguise. A battlefield in a kettle. Better ties. Just sometimes a peace treaty wrapped in steam. And tomorrow, when the sun cracks over the ragged hills and the cold bites just a little less hard, you'll stand beside the same hearth, bowl in hand, tasting another bizarre blend someone swears will improve your aim, and maybe it will. A storm is brewing. Not outside, though. The clouds look ready to drop something biblical but in your joints, your bones, and the aching weight of one too many nights on this God-forsaken wall. You feel it before you hear it. That low, creaking hum of approaching weather, like the sky groaning from the inside. Still, you move toward the tea station with that slow, almost sacred gait every soldier develops. You don't rush tea, not anymore, okay? Not after what you've learned. Tonight's brew is simple, right? Roasted millet husk and a pinch of pepper leaf. Earthy, slightly spicy. The cook says it wakes the soul. You're pretty sure it just makes your throat itch, but hey, anything to keep you from dozing off on watch. You sit on the warm stone lip of the fire pit, sipping slowly, letting the heat uncurl your fingers. There's something sacred about this last hour before midnight, and the wall feels less like a barrier and more like a spine connecting thousands of towers. Stories and sleepy men like you, each holding a cup, each bracing against the void. And this is where it all hits you. The sheer scale of it, the wall, the watchtowers, the ridiculous idea that someone once said, let's build a giant stone line across the mountains. And then people actually did it with rope, sweat, and more broken backs than anyone's. Count it. You're part of that now. It's just a tiny piece sitting in a cup of hot water in millet husk. It gets overwhelming sometimes. It's a sense of being swallowed by history. And that's why the tea matters. Because the tea stations weren't just for keeping warm or brewing herbal mood swings. They were about grounding people in something real, something daily, Something small enough to fit in your hand and big enough to make you feel human again. Modern historians love talking logistics, supply chain, continuity, IKEA, redundancy, ceremonial alignment of daily rituals. Fancy words for what soldiers just called T-o'clock. But in this final stretch of night, long after the jokes fade and the patrol boots scuff quieter, you realize the T-stations were lifelines, not just for warmth, not just for morale, but for memory. See, there is a tradition not written anywhere, but deeply understood among tower guards. Whenever someone falls, their bowl is never cleaned, not right away. It's left on the edge of the hearth, last tea intact until the next supply run. A silent nod to absence. Okay, we just say, he was here, he drank this, he mattered. Seen bowls sit for weeks, and sometimes, when the fire is crackling just right, you swear the steam off that old cup twists a little differently, like it's carrying stories upward tonight. That memory is strong. There's a bowl by the kettle no one has touched, belonged to Yao, the guy who made the worst jokes and best dumplings. He fell last month during a rock slide inspection. Slipped. Quick. No chance to scream. You all stood at the edge of the cliff, stunned by how sudden a person could vanish. You've kept his bowl full ever since. There's a fringe theory some historians love to bat around that certain garrisons believed. Tea steam carried thoughts to ancestors, that every boil was a kind of prayer. Maybe that's superstition. Maybe it's just another story the wall told itself to survive. Pint. When you refill Yao's bowl, you swear the room gets quieter, like he's still listening, like he's just on the other side of the smoke. Tea is ritual. Tea is remembrance. It's not the kind of thing the records capture, but it's the part you feel in your bones. There's another theory, less mystical, more tragic. Some scholars argue that the very act of maintaining tea stations was designed to prevent rebellion, a way to distract, regulate, ritualize the days so thoroughly that no soldier ever got too restless, too angry, too hungry for change. But you don't buy that. Not entirely, because there's nothing controlling about the quiet that tea brings. It's not an order, it's a gift. A breath between breaths, and breath is hard to come by out here. Now the storm finally breaks. Thunder growls across the mountains. Wind throws grit against the tower walls like angry bees. Rain follows light at first, then heavier, more insistent. You and the others shift closer to the hearth, bowls in hand. Steam curling around your faces like ghostly scarves. You don't talk. You don't need to. Someone ladles out another round. No one asks what's in it. You sip and find something. Sweet. At the bottom, maybe jujube, maybe stolen candy root. The cook winks. You pretend not to smile. A fox sprints past the open window, drenched and offended. You all snort quietly. Moments like these don't make it into the scrolls. No poet writes, for muddy guards laughed at a wet fox, but you'll remember it. Long after you leave this tower, long after your boots touch softer ground. The truth is, the Great Wall wasn't held together by stone. It was held together by bowls, by shared warmth, bad blends, and better company. By the strange and beautiful humanity of tea stations, built not just for war but for waiting. Because more than anything, it's what the wall teaches you. Waiting is an art. It needs patience, ritual, company, and the slow, whispering comfort of steam rising from something bitter, something hot, something alive. You sip, you wait, you remember, and across thousands of miles, another soldier does the same. Now, the kettle's gone quiet, not because it's empty there still, warmth left in the embers, but because everything else has hushed too. The rain has softened to a gentle drizzle, more mist than storm now, and the wind, once furious, has curled itself into a sleepy breeze. The fire inside the tower glows low, licking the last logs with lazy orange tongues. You sit there, not talking, not even really thinking, just feeling the weight of the day, the comfort of the warmth, the familiar curve of the tea bowl in your hand, smooth, worn, like the tower itself. Your eyes drift to the walls. Okay. Those ancient stones, darkened with time, with stories, with all the breath, in battle, in boiling water they've seen. You don't have to speak to them. They already know. They've outlived every name carved into them, and still, they hold you. You lean your head against the cool stone beside the hearth. Outside, the night folds in tighter. It's the last of the tea steams faintly from your both under now, lighter, like the very breath of the past rising one final time. A fox cries once in the distance, then nothing, and you let your eyes close, because here, on the edge of an empire, wrapped in heat and memory, you're not guarding a wall, you're guarding a moment. And for now, in the small pocket of stillness, it is more than enough. So rest. Easy, my friend. Let the towers keep watch for a while. Let the tea grow cold. Let the night carry you.